nowadays.
Alright, fine. So I think the first thing we should talk about is the placement of objects and procedure for microscribing. So you can see a configuration here where we have a laptop computer in front of me. I'm going to, from a point of view of ease, I'm going to assume that the user is right-handed. I'm right-handed. So this is set up for a right-handed person. Obviously you'd want the MicroScribe on the left-hand side if you're left-handed. You see here I've got a nice bit of padding. That's always useful if you want to protect specimens. There are two really important things when you're microscribing. One, that you can get to all the landmarks that you want to with the MicroScribe. So you need a distance between the object and the MicroScribe. It's not too far or too close. I tend to find a distance probably of about a foot and a half is about perfect for what you want, depending on the size of your object. I've got a cast of a hominin skull here. You can see I can pick up the MicroScribe in my right hand and I can get all the points here that I want to. Now, there's a whole nother issue of getting points underneath and that sort of thing. We're not going to address that here, but placement of the object is very, very important, that you can get to all points. So before you actually start collecting data, you want to be sure. So for instance, looking here, I'm going to have a hard time getting down to that point there. I've really got the MicroScribe at its furthest point, so I may want to put the skull a little bit closer. Now you see I can get to these points down here on the left side of the mandible easily enough. Okay, so you really want to make sure that you can get to all points in your object before you start scribing, and you need to play around a little bit and jiggle things. You can see I have the MicroScribe set back a little bit and to the right for ease of use, and then I have the screen in front of me here so I can see what's going on. So this is a fairly classic arrangement for an object. For much smaller objects, you can use clamps and you can use various ways of holding the object. For either small or big objects, what's really, really important is that the specimen does not move when you're microscribing it. That is one of the most important things, because then you won't end up with erroneous data. So once you've placed your MicroScribe and your specimen in positions that you're happy with, you have to make sure that the specimen doesn't move. And usually what we do is we secure the specimen with a little bit of clay just on the surface here. You can also clamp it if you don't damage it, or you can have a mechanism for holding it. I have a special mechanism for foot bones that I have so I can get to all points of it. It really depends, but the most important thing is that it does not move at all, so that when you collect all your landmarks for each specimen, neither the MicroScribe nor the specimen moves. Then, when you move it away, I'm going to pretend I bring another one in and then put your next specimen on. It doesn't matter if it is in a slightly different position, as long as it again doesn't move within that measuring session. Okay, so that is step one. It's just getting everything arranged and everything ready for microscribing. In terms of the landmarks that you use, the designated landmarks that you've already come up with, one other fundamental point that you should remember is that you need to always collect the landmarks in the same order. So you have landmarks 1 to 10, you collect them in the same order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, on the first specimen, the second specimen, the third specimen. That's very important too, otherwise it'll make your formatting of the data hellish later on. Okay, so now let's think about what we actually do in relation to how we actually collect the data using the computer. The MicroScribe is already on here. You can see there's a red light there. And what I'm going to do, this is the new G2 MicroScribe. Some older MicroScribes, which are serial port controlled, not USB port controlled, don't have this light. The old red MicroScribes don't. The newer grey ones do. And at the moment it's red, which tells me that it won't be working properly. There's a little button right on the back on the right hand side. I'm going to push that and now it will go green. Okay? And that tells me the MicroScribe is ready to go. And what I'm going to do now, I'm going to open up the MicroScribe utility software. It used to be called InScribe. There's multiple versions of this. But I'm now going to, it's now called MicroScribe Utility. There it is. It's got a little MicroScribe icon on it. I'm going to open it up. I'm going to ignore this first screen here. And then what we see here is the utility software screen. And there's a number of different things you should be aware of. First of all, there's an X, Y, and Z number here. And if I actually pick up the MicroScribe, you'll see the numbers change as I move it around, which tells me that it's live and working. And remember, the home position of the MicroScribe is from when you turn it on. So all those numbers are relative to the base position. Alright, now, if you look at these different tabs, they essentially relate to different options that you can play with. Input options, output options, scale, that sort of thing. If you click on any one of them, in fact, all 7 of them, there used to be 6, there's now 7, all 7 of them actually come up here. Now, for instance, the first one that comes up here is select format, and you've got a number of different program formats you can play with. AutoCAD, Notepad, Excel. For most physical anthropologists, Notepad or Excel are the norm, and I'm just going to highlight Excel here, which means that it will work directly into Excel. But you can do the same for Notepad, you can do the same for Word and a few other programs. Reference frames you don't need to worry about for now. Scale planes you don't need to worry about. Auto scan you don't need to worry about. MicroScribe information is not important. Configuration, this is important. You need to make sure your scaling factor is 1, i.e. it's a 1-to-1 scaling factor, there's no change. And then there's the units. Most people tend to prefer to collect in metric units, as we all know in science, but you do have also the option of using inches as well. And then this is a nice new module here. I wasn't aware of this until now, the custom tip. This has different tip offset parameters here. If you use a plastic tip or different types of tip, you can deal with the slight difference in size of the tip and the millimeter offset, subsequent millimeter offset as a result. Here it says use default tip, so we're just going to keep on that. So everything is ready now. We have it inputted into Excel. We have the units in millimeters. It's 1-to-1. I'm just going to click OK. And that's just going to sit there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up Excel. There it is. Alright, now there's a number of different ways of collecting data. What I'm going to do, and I'm just going to drag that down there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just start with a format that's very useful for users using the software Morphologica. But if you're using different software, there are different ways you may want to have the data arranged. In general, having your X, your Y, and your Z coordinates in essentially 3 columns is the smartest way to do it, and each landmark is represented by a single row. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to type in skull 1 in the first line just to tell me what it is. I'm going to press return. Now, you just point the camera here. There's a foot pedal. You can also use a hand pedal. I prefer to use the foot pedal. The reason being, the hand pedal, you tend to move a little more with it, and when you hit it on the table, you can sometimes move the table a little bit. So I find the foot pedal a little bit more easy because I can use this one hand to stabilize myself and use the other one to steadily place the MicroScribe tip on the landmark. But you can do either. So I'm going to start here, I'm just going to choose a landmark and I'm going to click it. There it goes. Landmark 1. You can see it entered. Landmark 2. Landmark 3. Landmark 4. Landmark 5. Landmark 6. Landmark 7. Landmark 8. Landmark 9. Landmark 10. Landmark 11. 12. 13. 14. 15. 16. 17. 18. 19. And so on. 20. 21. 22. Okay, I've just done these in random order, but you get the idea about how to collect them. You then put your specimen down, move it. You can then get out another specimen. Let's say this one. Put it down. Press space. Oops, no, hang on. There's the mouse. Leave a space. Put in skull 2. Let's return. And then collect your data accordingly. And so on. Okay? That's essentially the basics of microscribing. There's nothing more complicated than that. If you want to collect data all over an object like this and you have it placed on the ground, there are certain ways of using certain types of software where you can collect a series of landmarks and then rotate it, collect a few of the same landmarks so that you can register the two pieces of data together, and then collect the landmarks on the part of the skull, in this case, that previously wasn't available to be looked at, which is the cranial base here. Okay. The most important thing when thinking about formatting and preparing the data for analysis, when you're thinking about three-dimensional landmark data collected specifically with a microscribe, is that before you do anything else to the data, you have to put all your individuals that you've measured into a file, and you have to put them through what's called a superimposition technique. Okay? And the type of superimposition technique that we use is called Procrustes analysis, or generalized Procrustes analysis. As a small aside, Procrustes was a mythical giant who forced guests in his hotel to fit a bed of a very particular dimension, and guests whose legs were too long, he'd cut them off, and guests who were too short, he'd stretch them out. And so it's a fun mythological reference to adjusting the size of individuals to a one uniform size. We're actually doing more than that with Procrustes registration. The whole point of it is when you collect all the data on this skull and then you collect all the data on, say, a second skull, they might be in slightly different positions to each other relative to the microscribe. Those are nuisance factors. You absolutely do not want those differences in position to come into play when you're doing your analysis. So what you do is you take your data sets and you superimpose them on top of each other. And you do that by calculating the mean landmark for each one, which in both these cases would be somewhere right in the middle of the skull. You do this all on the computer, of course. These are superimposed on top of each other, and then each landmark in order. So landmark, all the landmark 1s, all the landmark 2s, all the landmark 3s, they're all basically instructed to have the distances between them minimized. So you're making all the landmark 1s as close to each other as possible, all the landmark 2s as close to each other as possible, and so on and so on. And what the actual sort of way you can visualize this is all the various landmark configurations jiggle around until all those landmarks are as close to each other as they can as possible. All the landmark 1s as close to all the other 1s as possible, all the landmark 2s as close to the other 2s as possible, and so on and so on. So it's a way of removing those nuisance factors of differences in position. So, as I was saying, the other thing that generalized Procrustes analysis, or GPA, does is that it adjusts for size. And the way it does this is it calculates a proxy for the size of each object, and it does that by taking the distance from each landmark to the central landmark, called the centroid, the sort of mean landmark in configuration. In fact, what it does is it takes every distance and it squares them and it adds them all together. It then takes a square root of that number, the reason being that you sometimes have negative values with your landmark with coordinates. So essentially, each landmark that you collect, each XYZ coordinate, is then divided through that size proxy called centroid size, and you end up with a new configuration of landmarks that are size adjusted, and every single individual then is basically scaled to the same unit size. Now, of course, you haven't factored out issues of allometry. It's quite possible that there's still a relationship between the different shapes of two different objects. Let me put that again. Two different objects may be different in shape because of their difference in size. So you need to factor back in size later on when you're thinking about your analyses. But for the purpose of the first level of analysis, size is adjusted for. It's not factored out, it's just adjusted for. And it's important that people understand the difference between that. And then once you've done this generalized Procrustes analysis, so once you've adjusted for these differences in position, and you remove these differences in position and you've adjusted for size, then your data is ready for multivariate analysis, like principal component analysis, discriminant function, and other forms of multivariate analysis. And we won't go into those quite yet at this stage, but suffice to say that the various programs that we use, like Morphologica and Morpheus, can do these, well, Morphologica certainly can do principal components analysis. So, just to reiterate, there's software out there, free software, to do the Procrustes analysis for you. You do not have to program anything to do this. Morphologica is one of the most popular pieces of software and is very easy to use, and in fact comes with its own sample data file that you can check to see what a data file looks like. Morpheus is also an excellent piece of software, and I think your website will have links to both of these. I believe there may be other software out there as well that does this. I'm not particularly aware of it. These are the two software packages that we use. I would personally recommend Morphologica for first-time users. It's a very, very easy to use, intuitive, and one of the nice things you can do is once you load up your file, you can analyze just parts of it or particular landmark configurations. You can take certain landmarks out. It's very, very easy to use at the front end. And it does your GPA for you, gets your data ready. And of course the whole point in a way of being able to do work with 3D landmarks, work in the realm of what we call geometric morphometrics, is that you can actually see what's going on. You can actually visualize the shape change when you do a multivariate analysis, and that's kind of cool. Alright, let's talk a little bit about getting a file together for Morphologica. Okay. When you're creating a file for Morphologica, what you want to do is use the Windows program Notepad and make or WordPad for that matter, or Word. But what's important is that you save it as a text file, text only, very simple text file with no formatting. Okay. So here's Notepad. So I'm gonna paste in. This is skull 1. This is the first skull that I measured. And all I'm going to do now is just paste in exactly the same one a few times. It's not going to show us anything different at this stage. Alright? That's great. So I've just done it 3 times. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to call it skull 1. Skull 2 and skull 3. Very simple. And you'll see I have a space between each landmark set, and that's really just helpful for visualizing where each one is. You don't actually need it. So I'll just leave one space, and that's going to be skull 3. Now, you can also see that each configuration, the first line of each configuration is the name of the individual, in this case skull 1, 2, 3. So when the data is actually analyzed and put through the GPA, the Generalized Procrustes Analysis, that first line, that label line, needs to be ignored. And in Morphologica, the equivalent of the do not read or remove command in programming is just an inverted comma. Okay, so I'm just going to put that in front of each one. And you can also do this in Excel if you want, but I find it can be helpful because you can automate it and have it done automatically. So there you go, there's 3. Alright? Then I need to enter a few extra lines at the beginning to tell the program what's going on. And in most cases we start with a simple command line followed by the information, and the command lines or the heading lines go in this square bracket. So the first one I'm going to do is landmarks, okay, end brackets, and the next line is going to be how many landmarks there are. In this case there are 22, so I'm going to type in 22. Then I'm going to type in individuals. Oops. So the third line you type in is dimensions, and that just tells you obviously how many dimensions you're using. In this case it's 3, and it's nearly always 3, well it is always 3 with XYZ coordinates. If you're just using 2D landmarks, then the dimensions of course would be 2. So I'm going to type in 3. Now, there are a number of different options that you can put in. There's an option called groups. Now, say you have 30 chimps and 30 gorillas. You would type in groups, and then on the next line, you'd type in chimpanzees space 30 space gorillas space 30. And that will tell it that the first 30 are chimps and the second 30 are gorillas. And as long as they're in that order in your file and your actual data lower down, that's fine. And that's very useful for when you're making different icons and graphs and that sort of thing later on in Morphologica. You can also type in, what I'm doing here is names, like that. And then underneath, just in list format, one after the other in rows, you can do skull 1, skull 2, skull 3. Now we've already done that actually in the actual data chunk itself, but it helps to do this, and you'll see why in a bit. There's one other thing that you can do, and I'm just going to do it here and then remove it. You can put in something called labels, and then you can say, right, I want to also include information on sex and age. I'm just using these as arbitrary categories. You could be any other categories you want. I then type in below that label values, and then for each individual in the same order as they actually are there, obviously, you might put male space 56, next line female space 78, next line male space 12, and so on. Now those labels can be anything: sex, age, population, color, whatever, it doesn't matter. But it's a useful way of pre-categorizing the data so that later on you can sort things out accordingly with various icons and graphs. Alright, right now we're just going to keep the names category. And then what I'm going to type in is raw points. Just the word raw points. RAWPOINTS. Again in square brackets. And that tells me that from now on, everything is raw data. Okay? What you then want to do is save that as a text file, and I'm just going to call this test, and save it on the desktop, and there it is. Now, we're not going to do this at this stage, but at the bottom you can also put information into the at the end of the data. You can type, and the help file of Morphologica helps you with this. You can type in square brackets the word wireframe, and under that you can join up landmarks. So say landmark 1, landmark 2, landmark 5, and landmark 9. And the way you do that, you just write 1 space 2 and return 5 space 9. And then when you actually try to visualize how the landmark configurations change in shape when you go from one individual to another, one group to another, you'll actually see the wireframe model, and it will have joined up those particular landmarks that you specify with an actual straight line. You can also do the same and make actual rendered polygons as well. We're not going to deal with that at this stage, it's a little bit more complex, but be aware that this is where you do it if you want your wireframe models to be visualized. Otherwise you're just visualizing points moving around. I'm going to go to New Project. I'm going to look for text files on the desktop. There's our one called test. I'm going to open it up. And what comes up here are a couple of different windows. There's this select data to analyze window, which is the main window, and if you double click on the folder there, you come up with your groups. And at the moment it's just group 1 because we haven't determined any other groups. And if you click on that, there it says skull 1, 2, and 3. And you can actually take various individuals in or out with these checkboxes. And so you can pre-decide which particular configurations you want to use. And on the right here, it's very useful if you drag it out, is actually a perfect rendition of the file that you created, just as a reference, and that's your input file. And later on, there's your output file here, which actually gives you output data after analysis. So you remember that when you start doing new things like regression and other such things, which you can do later on in Morphologica, all that information goes into the output file. Sometimes you spend ages trying to look for it, that's where it is. If you go back here to the select data for the main window here, you can click on each skull, you can also click on the coordinates, and you can actually take out individual coordinates that you don't particularly want to use. Bear in mind, if you do it for one, you're doing it for all. An easier way is to click on landmarks here, and you can just take out certain landmarks, so you can analyze subsets of landmarks as well, very, very easily, which is an incredibly useful front-end tool. In other programs, you have to do a lot of fiddling and playing around to do this sort of thing. It's all very intuitive and morphological. So presuming that you want to use everything, which in this case we will, I'm going to click OK. And what we're now looking at, you see, is actually a series of those landmarks that we collected. Now, these are all on top of each other, these landmarks, because they're the same individual, so you're not going to see any variation there. Okay? But if you look at it, we're looking at it from the side. This is the fossil that I collected, and there's the top of the skull, here's the eyes here, here's the nose. You're actually looking at something that's approaching the profile of a skull, which is kind of cool. And I just collected those very, very quickly. And what we're then going to do is we're going to do something called precrustics analysis. We've already talked about what that is. It's a superimposition technique. There's an ability to enable reflections here. That's only really useful if you're dealing with left and right bones. And what that does is, so you've got 50 left femora and 1 right femur, and you want to analyze them. Obviously, the difference between the left and the right landmarks are going to be a major difference when you do your analysis. You want to basically flip that right one to make it the left. So what it does is, the enable reflections, it takes the first individual that you have in the list, and it makes sure everything else is the same side as that. So if your first individuals are left, it will make everything left, including any rights. If the first individuals are right, everything that's right will stay right, and everything that's a left will be flipped to a right. So it's very important you remember that. And then there's also actually the option to put back in those funny scale and translation and rotation nuisance factors that you want, that you've removed in generalized precrustics if you want. We're not going to do that at this stage, obviously, so nearly always you just keep these off. I'm going to open up version 2.5 and get a new project. There's the example data file, and these are 15 specimens. I believe they're cranial specimens of primates, specimens 1 to 15. There's the landmarks there, 31 landmarks. This is the wireframe. Okay, so you can see there's pairs of landmarks here which will join up to actually make each wireframe line, and then actual what we call polygons, which are 3 landmarks essentially making up triangles which you can actually render and flat shade to make a visible sort of solid looking object, which is very useful. So we're going to go OK, we're going to use everything, and you can see here very nicely there's a whole series of different colored dots, and each dot represents a landmark and each color represents a different individual. Let's just expand it out for a while. You can see me rotate them around there, and what I can actually do, I can go to set, I can go to rendering and wireframe, and you can actually see a whole series of, these are actually skulls, and we're looking at the side of the skull here, all in different orientations. And if I use these left-right arrows here, I can actually go through each individual specimen. And you can see if I turn it round there, hey presto, we're actually looking at the skull of a monkey here. Here are the orbits here, okay, here's the nose here, here's the supraorbital region above here, and if you turn it round to the side, you can see its rather prognathous face. Alright, so I'm now going to click this central button between these left and right arrows here. That's going to show all the individuals, and I'm just going to reduce the size of this. Whoops, that wasn't very useful.
That just happens. That's fine.
Okay.
It'll clear up.
I'm going to go to Analysis, Precrustics Analysis, and I'm going to choose Start, and you see everything has been superimposed on top of each other now. Very nicely, very easy. And now I'm going to go to Principal Components Analysis. This is a multivariate technique that essentially compares every individual to every other individual. I'm not going to give you a tutorial about that here, but essentially, as I said, it compares every individual to every other individual, and it extracts factors that best reflect the major differences in shape in the first few axes of a large number of different axes that you can put together to make bivariate plots. So I'm going to do the Principal Components Analysis, the PCA, and there's various options there to do that. I'm just going to click Start at this stage, and you can see now that 4 windows come up, and I'm going to go to Windows Tile horizontally. Okay, and you now have a number of windows here open. You have a control window here in the top left. You have a window of the actual graph here in the bottom left. In the top right, you have a data summary window, and you actually have a 3D view of the shape data here. And if you left click the mouse, you can move that around. Now there's the wireframe. We're going to look at it straight on. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move the cursor around this graph here in a minute, and it's actually going to, depending on which particular point on the graph I'm nearest to, and each point on the graph represents a particular individual, it's going to warp this particular configuration to whatever point that we move to. So I'm going to click on Explore Shape Space there, and then I'm going to hold the left click down, and you can see I can move the cursor around the graph, and I can see how the shape changes, particularly say from this group here across to this group here. This could be two different species of monkey, it could be two different sexes of the same species, it could be juveniles and adults. I'll do it again. Let's click on there and move left and then right, up and down the y-axis. There's another way you can do this. You can just take these sliders here and move them up and down, and that does a more precise shape change according to each axis that you're looking at. Now, being that principal components analysis is analysis that gives you multiple axes depending on the number of variables you have, I can now click the third axis here and look at the arrangement of individuals on that third axis and the fourth axis and so on. And at the very bottom I can go down and I can choose size. You can also look at each principal component axis plotted against the size, and here we see principal component 1 on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is centroid size, and you can see there's a very strong linear relationship between the two. And in fact, you can do a regression of that and find out what the relationship is. So I clicked on the regression button here, and then I'm going to click on PC1 and then centroid size. You can also do log centroid size if you want, and click OK, and you get a nice regression line there. And if you go to output, here we go. I saved the results on the desktop. Here's the Procrustes output, and here's the regression information down here at the bottom. Adjusted R square, R is 0.7, R squared is 0.69, so that was very good. Okay, fine. That took a little bit of trying. And then the older one, it actually gave you the data. Anyway, I can do the same for 2. I can theoretically. I think for the regression, what you have to do is you have to choose multiple ones at the same time, and it'll give you the information for each one. Okay, you have to look in the help file for that. Anyway, as you can see, the main beauty of the whole thing is the ability to see what's going on in your analysis. You can also, if you highlight the blue 3D viewer window and go to rendering, you can also choose surface and flat shading, and you can see there's now a very nice three-dimensional rendition of that monkey face, and you can then go to explore shape space and see how the shape changes, which is really, really useful from a point of view of visualizing what's going on. Okay, and you can change the color of that to whatever you want. So if I don't like the background color, I can make it white, and if I don't like the object colors, I can make it orange, and so on. Okay, there's also a back face and a front face coloring scheme, so you can actually determine that certain triangles will be one color and another, depending on whether you put the order of landmarks in as clockwise or anti-clockwise. Okay, and there's various lighting things. You can change the lighting as well on that. Alright, and you can see here specimen 1 is a female. This is the log centroid size, and the x-axis score, and the y-axis score, and in this case the x-axis is PC1, the y-axis is PC2. So there's lots of different things that you can do with this data to analyze, with this software to analyze 3D data, particularly biological data. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Will.
That's it.